The Global Registry of Fossil Fuels was launched in September 2022 to help manage international carbon budgets. It seeks to do this by building an open source database of fossil fuel production at field level, with reserves and estimates of associated emissions from both production and reserves. It has been developed by Carbon Tracker and the Global Energy Monitor. The challenge the Global Registry is designed to help governments, investors, and global civil society address is the mismatch between carbon budgets under the IPCC process and the Paris Accord on the one hand, and current and future fossil fuel production plans on the other. As you can see in this chart, current proven reserves of oil, gas, and coal measure more than 7 times the maximum allowed carbon budget if we are to restrict global warming to 1.5 degrees. Carbon transparency is a key part of that picture. Although we have a good idea of emissions at a global level and parts of carbon dioxide per million in the atmosphere, for example, we do not have trusted granular data at asset level which can help us to determine what the levels of emissions are from this oil field or that coal mine. This makes energy transition policy difficult and negotiations between multiple parties almost impossible. The goal of the registry is to assist in bringing carbon transparency to the same place that transparency around revenues for natural resources already is through initiatives like EITI. As well as being open source and transparent, the registry is also completely policy neutral and will never argue in favor of or against any particular energy transition policy. Its goal is simply to serve as a trusted basis of numbers and insight for policy debate and decision-making. The launch has curated all information currently available in public domain, but the registry also sees a role for itself in working directly with governments to open up more data around carbon transparency and make it available directly in public domain through the registry. Here's the front page of the registry with the interactive map at the top, which allows you to drill down for data to country and field level. Here we show the extent of coverage at launch. We have data for nearly 50,000 assets exposed on the front end of the website from 89 countries. But you can also see that coverage of emissions is considerably less than 100%, and a lot of the data are irregular and heterogeneous. Here's a key piece of analysis matching estimated emissions from future production paths from a series of scenarios put out by the International Energy Agency against the carbon budgets from the IPCC, and estimating when on current and future production estimates we're likely to hit the ceiling of those carbon budgets. And finally, on the front page, the analysis section takes us to pieces of analysis around, in this case, around emissions embedded in projects now under development and on different interpretations of methane factoring of the kinds that we hope the registry builds over time. So let's take a look at the country level data through the map. If we pick a country, for example, Algeria, we get a snapshot of its latest oil and gas production data and the emissions from it. So in 2019 to 20, which is the last year for which we have comprehensive statistics, for Algeria, 523 million tons of emissions or thereabouts. And when you go down, you can choose between various production sources, EIA, which is part of the American government, BP Statistical Analysis, or OPEC, and you can see that there are some differences in production estimates because of different methodologies. And here we see those emissions broken down between those from burning it, from combustion of oil and gas, and those in the supply chain. Another point to recognize here is that these dotted lines represent midpoints of ranges, but the ranges of emissions estimates can be significant. So in this case, from 450 million tons up to 630, with 523 million tons as the midpoint. All of this data is downloadable off the button on each screen. Moving down, we see the latest year put in historical context, but again from a variety of sources available. And then we come down to different scenarios going into the future applied to Algeria. So we see here that if there was no change to policy in Algeria, we might expect emissions to be at a roughly similar level to what they are now. But if we go into a net zero situation, we could see those emissions from production decline to nearly half by 2040. Obviously, different countries are in different positions with regard to net zero, depending on the age of fields, the reserves available, and various other factors. This is no more than indicative of what might happen because the scenarios are built at a global level and then factored down to countries. But it's designed to provide thought experiments and insights to the future production and emissions paths country by country. Then coming down, we have a survey of the largest fields. We will get into the detail of that in a second. And lastly here, the underlying historical production and reserves data from all available sources at country level. So that's a quick tour of what you see at country level. And now, if you were to go into a field, here we see a large Algerian field, Hassi Massoud, for which we have a data point of 182 million barrels collected last year, with an estimate of 101 million tons of emissions just from this field. It's Algeria's largest field. And you have the same principle here. These are the emissions from burning the oil and gas. These are the emissions in the supply chain, relatively high in Algeria. The intensity of carbon emissions in the supply chain varies a lot from one country to another. With the totals downloadable. And here we have the access to the original sources which the registry has taken. So the source for this field level data is Global Energy Monitor. And if you want to, you can go straight to their website, or you can go to the Google Drive, which stores Global Energy Monitor data and tracks the processing and normalization of data into the database. Or you can inspect all data sources coming into the global registry. Here, there are currently about 45 data sources with 600,000 records. But there is also, as you can see here, a long tail of other data sources yet to be processed because they are locked in PDF files or other non-interactive formats. The registry has also collected an amount of data and emissions factors which can be combined with other data sets to start to produce insight. So, for example, here we see emissions represented by the size of the bubbles for major oil, gas and coal producers against World Bank natural resource rent data, and also against the level of economic development of the countries involved. This data is 2010 to 2020, so predates the current explosion in prices. But you see there coal with very low rents along the bottom, oil and particularly OPEC oil with high rents relating to those portions of emissions, and a significant amount of OECD production, but also, interestingly, low rent. So that's a fusion of emissions data from the registry with World Bank natural resource rents. Another example would be the relative carbon intensity in the supply chain. Here you see separate estimates for carbon dioxide and for methane, which is increasingly important in our understanding of overall carbon dioxide equivalence measures. Here we see the kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per barrel of oil equivalent country level production for gas, or also available switching to oil. So those kinds of analytical functions also available now on the registry, with hopefully more built over time. Looking forward, we see more work on emissions at field level where data allow it. Here's a representation of Norway's largest fields showing emissions from combined oil and gas production since 2000, the beginning of a basis to look forward into the future. And in the United States, the recent Inflation Reduction Act, with its methane fee, gives the registry the possibility to assess the methane liability in financial terms for over 30,000 assets in the United States. Some of the collaborations already undertaken have been with EITI, meshing registries' estimates of emissions against EITI tax and revenue data to provide a metric of dollars into the treasury per ton of carbon dioxide. A series of briefings for the Scandinavian investment management firm Nordea around oil and gas operators' methane emissions, and an Excel model which contains all of the data in the registry itself and allows more proactive modeling of managed decline scenarios at a field level. Our goals then are to assist in identifying stranded assets on an economic level, to begin to integrate data from satellites from the EU and from America, where these are becoming available, to engage directly in next generation carbon reporting with governments, involving active collaboration to achieve better data and a better empirical basis for data. There are also early stage discussions with UN agencies to get the registry formally adopted within the United Nations, because the goal is to create a tool that has international legitimacy, which is the final point. The end goal for the registry is to be embedded in the framework of international decision-making as the tool of reference for emissions estimates around carbon negotiations.